It's Big 12 Radio. We are presented by Modelo, heard on TuneIn, watched on Big 12 Studios. Our Big 12 game of the week in basketball is Saturday. Texas Tech at BYU. BYU has been struggling a little bit, including last night's loss to Cincinnati. Texas Tech loses to TCU last night, so both look to rebound in their season finale. Texas Tech at BYU Saturday, 10:30 Eastern, 9:30 Central. That's our game of the week here on TuneIn. All right, Brian Thornton joining us in studio here, the VP of basketball for the Big 12, VP of men's basketball. James Westling, Ari Temkin, Brian Thornton. How are you, Brian?
I'm doing well, man. Good to be with you guys.
Yeah, great to have you. We were just talking at the break. 3 technicals assessed to Kansas in the first half of their game against Arizona State last night. Self was ejected. And you were just talking about this, like, and it's obvious, like, there's frustration this time of year with coaches, with fans, with players, with officials. Like, it's the end. Like, the end is near, but yet you're closing out the regular season. The last couple of weeks, it feels like, of the regular season can be a slog at times.
Yeah, I mean, everybody's a little bit irritable this time of the year. I think that if you go back and look at, the amount of technicals or ejections that take place in late February, early March, I'm sure it's more than it is in December or early January. But, the stakes are high, and they continue to get higher just with the investment the institutions are putting in, that fans are putting in. So people feel that this time of year. Everybody's fighting for inches. They're scratching, they're clawing, they're trying to either make it into the NCAA tournament. For some guys, they're trying to fight for seeds. For other guys, they're trying to hold on to their jobs. So it's not a surprise that, people start to feel that way this time of year. And it's a long year. When you really think about when these guys get started, they get started in the summer and, with preseason camp, and then, they're 30 games in, and, quite honestly, our officials are tired too. They've had a long run as well. So, we're all trying to get to the finish line, and we're trying to get there in the best way that we can.
Brian, can you elaborate more on just the wear and tear that a season can have on these teams? Because, I mean, you've been through it as a coach and a player. What's it like, and how do you stay dialed in this late in the year?
Well, I think that's where coaching really comes in. The way that these teams are constructed now is different than it's ever been before. This is, for most teams, their players are 10-month mercenaries. They come in, they're hired guns, and coaches that are able to put together a roster in short order, then they're able to get them to gel, but they're also able to kind of keep guys in the boat. That's kind of the biggest thing that you have to do, especially this time of year when we kind of talked about teams are going in different directions. Some teams are trending up, some teams are trending down, some teams are trying to hold on to the rope. And coaches and staffs are really important, assistant coaches, about kind of pouring into guys, rallying guys together, putting a positive voice in their ears, because we know that, because of agents and families and all the other things, that there's a lot of competing voices for these young men and young women. And coaching staffs really come into play about how you can kind of keep the narrative positive and keep the main thing the main thing.
This is a very interesting bubble in the Big 12. We know who's in, and there's a good collection of bubble teams now. I'm curious for kind of your position in that. Do you have communication with members of the committee? I mean, how are you monitoring the bubble? Are you working with teams? I'm just, again, have no idea here. What's your position in
all of the above?
Yeah.
Everything that you said is part of my responsibility. As you said, we have a blessing in that we have a lot of teams that are in secure spots, that are fighting for high seeds. And then, we have a pretty strong bubble, right now too, that we have quite a few teams that are fighting in the last week of the season, which is what you want. Our goal has always been to get at least 8 teams into the tournament. It feels like we're right in the mix for that. We're probably somewhere between 7 and 9, and depending on how things fall over the course of the next 10 days or so. So from my standpoint, I stay in constant communication with the NCAA basketball committee. In fact, I have a Zoom with them tomorrow where we'll kind of go through all of the teams. They'll ask me, how I see our rankings stacking up. I'm able to provide some context around wins, around losses. When, maybe a team lost the game they shouldn't have. Was there a reason? I'll give you an example. Cincinnati right now is playing some of the best basketball in the country, and they have a couple chinks in their on their resume.
Yeah.
And, they didn't have the greatest non-conference, but they've really started rolling downhill late. And so a couple of, anecdotes that I might provide to the committee are, one, Jizzle James didn't join the team until December 17th. So, they're a way above 500 team with Jizzle James than they were without Jizzle James. Additionally, they lost a game to Eastern Michigan. Not a great loss. Probably a quad 3, quad 4 loss. But there's context around that. One, Jizzle James wasn't playing, and two, Baba Miller wasn't playing in that game. So those are two. I mean, it doesn't necessarily justify the win, but it provides some context to the committee around why that loss might have taken place, and why you need to maybe view Cincinnati from a slightly different lens than just what you see on paper.
Do you think Cincinnati has more work to do?
Well, I think they have to continue to win. That they've done a great job lately. Again, like I said, their non-conference wasn't probably what they wanted it to be.
Yeah.
But if you look at their last 10 games or so, I think they've won 7 of their last 8 or something like that. So they're certainly putting themselves in position. If you trust Joe Lenardi, which I think that we all have to look at what he does, because he's kind of the gold standard, at least from what we can see. And, he has them in the next 4 out right now. So I think that they're certainly trending. They were kind of off the grid, and now they're very much on the grid. I was watching him last night, and he said that they put themselves in position to be in position.
Yeah.
And, they certainly have a huge game on Saturday against TCU, at TCU. And then we'll kind of see where things land in Kansas City next week.
Yeah, Brian, man, I love that you're going to highlight Cincinnati, because they, like you said, they've won like 7 of their last 10. They have definitely won 6 of their last 7. And they go on the road and they beat Kansas by 16. And then the way they've just destroyed their last 2 opponents, Oklahoma State and BYU last night. I mean, hanging 90 on BYU. To me, they look like a clear-cut NCAA tournament team that's hampered by losses that, frankly, in my opinion, when Jizzle James wasn't part of this team, shouldn't matter back in November.
Well, it all has to matter. I think that everybody could say that, our team was this or our team was that at a different point of the year. But I think without question, they've shown that their caliber, to win some of the games that they've won this year in the fashion that they've won. Wes Miller is doing a fantastic job down the stretch here. And, if you're looking at the eye test, I think it'd be hard-pressed for the committee to say they don't look like an NCAA tournament team.
Yeah, currently the latest Joey bracketology has Cincinnati as the next 4 out. So just interesting stuff to look at. 8 teams in, according to Joe Lenardi, with Cincinnati as part of the next 4 out. And I think West Virginia's loss last night did itself no favors there. So I think you're right, maybe anywhere between 7 and 9. But it feels like TCU's done enough at this point, right?
I mean, I think, just like we talked about Cincinnati, I think TCU has shown its merit. Going on the road and winning at Texas Tech last night, I think that says a lot about what Jamie Dixon has done with that team. That, they're a little undersized, but wow, they've played really good basketball, and they've just found a way. Different than maybe some of the other teams in the league, like Cincinnati, for example. They also have some real wins too. They beat Florida, they beat Wisconsin. And, there's context around some of their losses as well. But they're probably 5 or 6 possessions away from being a top 15 team in the country when you really think about it.
Wow.
They had Michigan on the ropes. They were up with 4 minutes to go in that game. They were up against Notre Dame at the end of the game and lost in overtime. They had Kansas down 20.
Yeah.
So when you kind of think about a few of the games that they've been in that the ball didn't bounce their way, or they weren't able to kind of close those games out when they were up late, all of a sudden you flip those losses into wins, and that's a team that looks like a 5 seed.
But they have figured out how to close. That Kansas game was atrocious. Not just the 20-point lead, but the 6 or whatever they were down. Kansas was down with like a minute to go. They're closing that. It's gone 180 degrees the other way. They figured out how to close.
Well, you learn.
Yeah.
You learn. And, Coach Dixon's been doing it for a long time. He's had a lot of success, both at Pittsburgh and TCU, and he's found a way to win with sometimes, not the most amount of talent. And, I think that it's no surprise that his team has gotten better over the course of the year, and they've learned lessons from the Michigan game. Or, even when they lost to Michigan, we probably didn't exactly know how good Michigan was going to end up being.
Right.
Notre Dame, they were playing a Notre Dame team that's a different team than Notre Dame is now, with some of the players that they had at the time. And so I think that they've had some learning lessons, and, they're finding a way out to close. They've had some guys really step up and become leaders, and, they're going to be a tough out for guys.
Brian, when it comes to how you put the schedule together, is that pretty much, I guess, the idea of teams going out to the desert and playing Arizona and Arizona State, and then going up to Utah and playing BYU and Utah? I know that the league puts these little road swings together, but Big 12 teams are now 4-12 immediately after playing Arizona, and Arizona State's got 5 of its 7 league wins against teams on that post-Arizona, beat-down hangover. Do you think you'll get any feedback from coaches hey, man, this is brutal, we'd rather come out here 2 separate times, or do you think is it locked in to stay the way it is?
Well, I think we'll always take coaches and administrators' perspectives into account when we're building the schedule out. I think generally speaking, what we've heard in the past is that, teams like to make that run together. When they do have an opportunity, when they're going to Utah, they want to play 2 games. When they're going to Arizona, they want to play 2 games because they don't want to crisscross the country any more than they have to. It's not a perfect science, but, when you have the leagues the size that ours are, or the Big Ten or the ACC, that's the way the schedule is typically going to be built. There's efficiencies there, and it almost starts to feel more like an NBA schedule. The way that you do it, you go on road trips and you have swings where you play 2 games at a time over the course of 4 or 5 days, and you got to pack your lunch. you got to have all your stuff together, and but again, it's not perfect. But if coaches want to talk about alternatives, that's something that we'll talk about. But we certainly haven't received that feedback per se yet.
Brian Thornton, VP of Men's Basketball. Can't wait to be with you in Kansas City next week. What a great finish it's been, and can't wait to see how this thing goes.
Awesome. Good to see you guys.
Yeah, great to see Brian Thornton visiting us in studio. Great stuff, as always, as we get from Brian here at the end of the season, along with James Wesley. I'm Ari Temkin. All right, our spring caravan rolls along. We're stopping in Stillwater, Oklahoma next, and talking with the new head football coach of Oklahoma State, Eric Morris, is next. It's Big 12 Today on Big 12 Radio, presented by Modelo. Heard on TuneIn, watched on Big 12 Studios.